Welcome to Adam Smith's Panmure House. I'm Professor Adam Dixon. I'm the Adam Smith Chair here. It's my pleasure to welcome you on this beautiful Edinburgh evening for what is one of our important activities that we do through the year, and that's the Adam Smith Lecture Series, graciously and provided by support from Baillie Gifford. Now, before introducing our speaker this evening, I wanted to relate something that one of our previous Adam Smith lecturers said, and that lecturer was Neil Ferguson, or Sir Neil Ferguson. And I've wanted to say this because I've heard Neil say it multiple times, and you'll hear Neil say that all the great ideas came from Scotland, in particular in the 18th century when Adam Smith and his contemporaries were meeting here in Panmure House, thinking about the world, and thinking about the ideas and explaining how a commercial society works. And those ideas have gone on to shape the modern world as we know it. Now, of course, Neil Ferguson, being a Scot, would probably also say that also the great thinkers still come from Scotland. And I would actually say that is true if we consider the speaker that we have this evening. Our speaker, though he left Scotland many decades ago, he left in 1969, but he was and still is a son of Edinburgh. And that person is Sir John Kay, who is one of Britain's leading economic and business thinkers of our day. Someone who has consistently, over decades, maintained a scholarship and a public engagement and an engagement with business that still is relevant, as we'll see in the talk today. His most recent book being The Corporation in the 21st Century, Why Almost Everything You Know About Business is Wrong. On that note, I don't want to go through John's extensive CV and all the experience he has and the posts that he's held and the government advisory positions and the fellowships he's had, in part because it'll make those of us that aspire to be like John feel bad about ourselves. But more importantly, because it would take too long, and I don't want to take too much time away from this great thinker, this great son of Edinburgh, who's come back to relate his new book, and we'll have a conversation at the end. So on that note, please welcome Sir John Kay.
One of the aspects of delivering a talk about business in the present environment is that it's inevitable that you will be asked questions about what is in the morning's papers or the evening news. And that means I have to keep up with the morning's papers and the evening news. So last week I found myself reading an article, several articles in fact, about the angry vets. The complaint of vets is that they're being asked to meet targets for treatments and revenues. This was the picture on the BBC News only last week. The complaint is that vets are being asked to meet targets for treatments and revenues. Now, of course, what the pet owner wants is a vet who is motivated by love of animals and concern for the pet, not by the bonuses will accrue or if targets are met. That controversy is something we might discuss in more detail later, because it's a result of the consolidation of vet practices. The purpose of the consolidation is backed by private equity funds which want to monetize the goodwill which is accrued in various kinds of local practices, things like vet practices, care homes, estate agencies and the like. And that's been a phenomenon in Britain of the last 5 years or so. Now, that picture is one which would appeal to people who caricature the work of Adam Smith. You can see the visible hand cuddling the pet. In the meantime, the invisible hand is rifling the pockets of the pet owner. Adam Smith's metaphor of the invisible hand is probably the best known thing he wrote. But of course that wasn't what he meant by the invisible hand. It's still well known, though. It's caricatured by the humorist Stephen Lecoq, who said, "Adam, Adam, Adam Smith, this is what I charge you with. Didn't you say in the class today that selfishness was bound to pay? Of your doctrines, that was the pith." Of course, it wasn't the pith at all, but it's regarded as the pith by many people who want us to admire what they think is the work of Adam Smith, which typically they have not read. If you have read the work of Adam Smith, you will know that sympathy and empathy are key concepts in Smith's writing, and the vet we might think Smith would admire. I'm sure he didn't keep a dog, and I don't know how a dog would have managed in Panmure House, but while I doubt if pets were very high on Smith's agenda, I'm sure the vet he would admire would be the vet who was concerned for the animal and its owner. So few people who reference Smith's concept of the invisible hand have any idea of the context in The Wealth of Nations in which it was written. The passage that talks about the wealth of nations is to be found in a chapter entitled "Restraints upon the Importation from Foreign Countries of Such Goods as Can be Found at Home." You will recognize that Smith was referring to some current controversies at the time. In that chapter, Smith was, of course, writing about tariffs. And Smith wasn't very sympathetic to tariffs. He was not unduly critical either, though. What he did was to emphasize that tariffs weren't necessary to encourage domestic manufactures because there was a strong home country bias. People preferred to buy from producers in the country in which they lived. And that's still true today. If you go to France, you will notice that many people are driving Renaults. But there's much less of a bias towards home country than there was then, for the rather obvious reason that if the most rapid means of transport is a horse, the ability to source internationally is very limited indeed. Now, Smith was a major figure in the Scottish Enlightenment, and of course we're here in Panmure House celebrating that Enlightenment. Adam Ferguson was Smith's contemporary and colleague in the Enlightenment, and Ferguson's essay, published 10 years before The Wealth of Nations, expresses the idea which Smith was getting at in that famous passage about the invisible hand. Ferguson expressed it as saying that institutions might be the product of human action, but not of human design. That's a very important idea, and it's one which was central to Smith's work as well as Ferguson's. And Ferguson, Smith, and other figures who talked about these questions in Panmure House were groping towards an idea that would only really be well expressed in the 19th century by Charles Darwin and the people who followed him, the idea of evolutionary progress, in which things develop which are the result of human action, but not of human design. Last year, I'm glad to say, we celebrated in this room the work of Joe Henry, who has probably done more than any other writer in the last few years to explain the relevance of that work to technological and economic progress. Ferguson and Smith were contemporaries in the Enlightenment, but they quarrelled. And we believe that the quarrel was, this is quite hard to credit, the quarrel was over the pin factory. Smith, as you all know, begins The Wealth of Nations with a description of a pin factory. And Ferguson believed that Smith had actually plagiarized this idea. He'd plagiarized it from a lecture that Ferguson had given some years earlier. That may or may not be true, but what is certainly true is that both Smith and Ferguson had actually not been to a pin factory, despite what says. They had plagiarized the pin factory concept from Diderot's French Encyclopedia, because the centre of making pins in Europe was not in Scotland at all. It was actually in Normandy. And anyway, the quarrel between the two was probably over Smith's reference to the pin factory and use of that example to elaborate the nature of modern production. And they were not actually reconciled until shortly before Smith's death here. Now, they hadn't been to a pin factory. Some commentators trying to write about that have conflated pins and nails, because Smith certainly had been to a nail factory. Nails, Kirkcaldy was a Scottish centre of nail making. But nails, believe it or not, I find it hard to credit, I believe this, nails were an artisanal product. One man made a nail, whereas the whole point of Smith's account of the pin factory was that a dozen people were occupied in the production of pins. As I say, the centre of pin manufacture in Europe was in Normandy, and I took the opportunity of being in northern France last year to visit the archetypal pin factory, which is traces its origins to the early 18th century, and is aware of the significance of the pin factory for economic history and for Scottish thought. But not surprisingly, in Normandy, they don't make much of the point. Smith wrote about the pin factory. Edwin Cannon, a historian of economic thought, criticised Smith for writing at length about the pin factory, whereas he should have been, Cannon said, talking about the Carron Works at Stenhouse Muir, which were probably, certainly the largest industrial plant in Scotland, quite possibly the largest industrial plant in Europe and the world at the time. The Carron Works used the production processes which had been developed in England at Iron Bridge and employed several thousand people. It may have been even the largest industrial facility in the world at the time. And Cannon was rightly criticising Smith for writing about the pin factory instead of taking an interest in the iron and steel works and textile mills, which were part of the Industrial Revolution. You'll be pleased to hear, however, that Scotland's greatest poet, Robbie Burns, did manage to visit the Carron Works. He was not admiring, and he was not well received. "We camna here to view your works," he wrote, "in hopes to be more wise, but only should we gang to hell, it would be no surprise." And he went on, when we tirled at your door, the porter doubtna bear us, say may, should we to hell's yet come, the billy Satan sare us. As I say, Burns was not impressed by the Industrial Revolution. But the ironworks, such as that at Stenhouse Muir, if you go to Stenhouse Muir, you will see the relics of what was once the ironworks. And you will also discover that the properties, the residential properties, the houses of Stenhouse Muir, many of them were built by the owners of the Carron Works in order to accommodate the people who had left the fields in order to help make iron there. But the ironworks and the textile mill were the archetypal businesses of the Industrial Revolution. And they remain so in our minds today. We could say a lot tonight about what I've called manufacturing fetishism, the idea that only basic manufacturing contributes to real growth. And of course, iron and steel are the archetypal manufactured products. What's quite extraordinary, it seems to me, is about the government rescue in the last couple of weeks of the Scunthorpe Steelworks is not simply that taxpayers are required to contribute what seem astonishingly large sums of money in order to keep these steelworks going, but everyone is in favour of it. The Conservatives, Labour and Conservatives, agree that this is the thing to do. Amazingly, Reform and the Greens also think it's what we should be doing. And the Liberal Democrats, of course, chip in on both sides. The only reservation the SNP has is that the government should use this as a precedent for supporting the refineries at Grangemouth, as well as the English works at Scunthorpe. Manufacturing fetishism is deeply in our minds. But one of Smith's central insights was the propensity of humans to engage in exchange. There are several passages as well of that in which he writes about that desire to truck and exchange. You may need steel, but, he explained, you don't have to make it yourself if you can make something that other people will exchange their steel for. And that was, of course, the idea developed later by Ricardo when he talked about comparative advantage, and subsequently the division of labour based on comparative advantage has grown to an extent that Smith could never have imagined. And in the centuries that followed, manufactured processes based on assembly lines proliferated. If we'd met here 100 years ago, we'd have been celebrating the completion of the Ford Motor Works on the River Rouge at Lake Michigan. Carron Works may have been the largest industrial plant of 1776, but the Ford Motor Works at River Rouge were the largest industrial plant in the world at that time. That just gives you a glimpse of the extent of the Ford plant. It's orders of magnitude larger than the Stenhouse-Muir plant, and it's orders of magnitude more than anything else in industry at that time. The Carron Works, the River Rouge plant rather, was owned and built by the Ford Motor Company, principal shareholder Henry Ford. In fact, Ford bought out minority shareholders in the Ford Motor Company in order to leave him free to develop that plant himself. And indeed, his obsession with control was so extensive that there's even now an area of Brazil which is called Fordlandia, because Ford thought he needed to grow the rubber which would be used to make the tires which would go on Ford cars. That was business, the archetype of business in the early 20th century. 50 years later, after the River Rouge was built, General Motors epitomized the 20th century. While there are many similarities between Ford's River Rouge plant and the General Motors plant there are also some significant differences. What General Motors does there is to emphasize its role as assembler of automobiles. It's still true that most of what goes into that car is made either by General Motors owned plants or by firms which are essentially dedicated to providing components for General Motors. But if you followed the ludicrous recent exchange between Elon Musk and Peter Navarro, to go back again to what has been in the news in the last couple of weeks, he will have noticed that Navarro accused Musk of being an assembler of cars rather than a proper manufacturer of cars. Manufacturing fetishism once again. Real work in this perception is what is done by men who go to labour in a factory and go home exhausted after a day's toil to enjoy a shower. Sorry, I wrote that in a hurry. Ford's men would not actually have been able to have showers at home. They might, if they were lucky, have been able to have a shower before they left work. But Navarro is basically right. The modern firm is increasingly an assembler rather than a manufacturer. But Navarro is wrong, because there is nothing wrong with that. That is the nature of modern business. That's one difference. The move from complete control of the manufacturing process to being assembler of pieces made by a variety of people was a major 20th century change. Second difference, of course, is that General Motors, unlike Ford, was a listed corporation whose shares were widely held. Stock exchange had come into being in the 19th century. The funding for railways and railroads was raised from a broad group of well-off middle-class investors. The Bronte sisters, for example, were enthusiastic and actually not very successful investors in railway companies at the time. That's the second difference, the dispersion of ownership of the shares of companies. And the third difference is that General Motors, the General Motors of this slide, was not controlled by an autocrat like Henry Ford, but by a team of professional managers. Alfred Sloan, who was CEO of General Motors for most of the interwar period, put a lot of emphasis on building a management team. And he and his financial officer, Donaldson Brown, hired Peter Drucker to document what they had done in building a management team at General Motors. Thus, in parallel with the development of education, marked the beginning of the idea of professional management. And by the 1960s, it seems that Sloan's ambition had been largely achieved. In the 1950s, Fortune began compiling an annual list of the world's leading corporations. Of course, General Motors was at the top of the list. It was followed by other automobile companies, steel manufacturers, and by oil companies. That was business as it had developed through to the 1960s and 1970s. And then it all began to change. This is Cupertino, the headquarters of the Apple Corporation. You might contrast Cupertino with the River Rouge. Firstly, it's a fraction of the size. It's about a tenth of the size. Secondly, there's no evidence of the steel or these other things. And most of what is at Cupertino is actually grass. This is what Cupertino looks inside. They won't allow people to photograph people working in Cupertino, but it wouldn't be terribly interesting even if they did. They'd be sitting on screens. Why did it change? How did this change come about? Well, in retrospect, we can see that the 1960s were a pivotal decade. Adams has described how they were a pivotal decade for me, but we won't go into that in any great detail. The 1960s were the years of the Beatles, the contraceptive pill, the Vietnam War, and of course the student demonstrations in 1968, which unseated, believe it or not, the presidents of both France and the United States. The 1960s were also a change in the nature of business. and a change in business due to technology, due to different views about the nature of the firm, and due to changes in political and economic philosophy. Let me say a little bit about each of these. First of all, technology. 1968 was, of course, the year a man reached the moon. One small step for man, Neil Armstrong said, a giant leap for mankind. In retrospect, it's rather difficult to say it was a giant leap for mankind. Nothing much actually happened. And that's a lesson which you should have in mind when you hear, because there's quite a lot nowadays of people talking about moonshots, missions and the like, that it's quite difficult to argue from an economic point of view that putting a man on the moon was a transformational event, or indeed something of much economic significance. But there were some things that were important at the time. The general purpose microprocessor, which meant that you could have small devices which perform multiple functions, was created in about that time. The internet was first seen in 1969 when ARPANET enabled computers to talk to each other. And of course there were large advances in medicine at the same time. All this changed the nature of the businesses that produced these things. So if you had seen in the late 60s and through the 70s that information technology was important, you would have been right, but you would have bought IBM, and indeed people buying IBM made IBM the most valuable company in the world. You wouldn't have been right as far as what would have been a good investment in the future. You would have done better. You would only have done that if you had bought Microsoft and Apple. So that's one important change, the technology that changed the nature of business. And now the most valuable commodity per kilo in the world that I can find at the moment is not gold. It's the Pfizer COVID vaccine. And of course, the value of the COVID vaccine, like the value of other products we're talking about, is in the ideas that go into it, rather than in the stuff itself. This is the modern product. This is Steve Jobs with his smartphone. And you can see the essence of what is happening to business in this change. The smartphone is performing many of the functions of the telephone. It's not actually a very old-fashioned telephone. I wanted a telephone like the one my grandmother had in her hall. But you see the idea. It has a telephone. It takes many of the functions of the library, the atlas, the fax machine, and of course the record player. All these things in the single gadget that Jobs is holding in his hand. The essence of the smartphone then is the combination of functions which it enables you to provide. It's the combination of capabilities which is the basis of the modern firm. And the word entrepreneur, there's a joke which I fear the story is apocryphal, but I still like the story, that Tony Blair told George Bush told Tony Blair that the trouble with the French is they don't have a word for entrepreneur. There's an interesting point to the joke, which is if you ask what the French origin of entrepreneur is, it is the person who brings between. The entrepreneur, in the traditional sense, was the person who combines a set of capabilities in the way Jobs is doing for this purpose. And of course that goes through not just to the functionality of the smartphone itself, but to the assembly of the iPhone. The smartphone, the iPhone, is typically assembled. Currently in mainland China, there is muttering about transferring production, not of course to America, but to other Asian countries. The assembly costs about $20. It's done by Foxconn, which is owned by the Taiwanese Honhai Industries. It's a Chinese-based subsidiary that does that kind of thing. And actually, the largest supplier of parts for the iPhone is Samsung, which is Apple's principal rival. You can see the change, start to see the change in the nature of a firm. Firms were once defined by their capital and their plant. The General Motors plant defined the firm. The River Rouge plant even more clearly defined General Motors. But now what we have is what I think of as capital as a service. That capital is just another product that people buy in the way they buy water and electricity and so on in order to build businesses. If you go in an airline, you probably think that the plane you're traveling in is owned by the airline whose logo is on the fuselage. It almost certainly isn't. The largest owner of civil aircraft in the world is a company called AerCap, based in Dublin, and it employs lots of accountants and regulatory experts, but it doesn't employ pilots. You might think that the people who own the plane own the engines of the plane. They don't, typically. What an airline will do will make a contract, perhaps for 10 years of engine services for the plane, and it will make that contract with a company like Rolls-Royce or Pratt & Whitney or General Electric, a company that is a specialist air engine producer. And then you'll discover that that company probably doesn't own the engine either. The Rolls-Royce or Pratt & Whitney will have sold on the engine on the plane to GATX, for example, a major owner of engines, which is also probably the owner of the rolling stock of the last train you travelled on. That's true right across the board of business today. If you pass an Amazon warehouse, one at Dunfermline, for example, on the way here, you probably don't own. You will see Amazon painted on the side, but that warehouse isn't owned by Amazon. It's typically the largest owner of Amazon warehouses or fulfillment centers, as they call them, is Prologis, a real estate company based in San Francisco. And the workers in the fulfillment center don't know that Prologis owns the plant because it doesn't matter to them who owns the plant. They work for Amazon. That's how business operates today. And if you still live in a world where you imagine that these businesses, modern businesses like Apple and Amazon, are controlled by capitalists, then think for a moment. I suspect if a Martian came to Earth and you asked him who owned Apple, he would say Tim Cook rather than Laurent Jobs, because Tim Cook is, insofar as there's anyone who makes the decisions, and of course the essence of Apple is that very many people are involved in producing the product and in making decisions. The concept of ownership of these corporations simply doesn't arise or have much relevance. Neither Tim Cook nor Laurent Jobs own Apple. Tim Cook is CEO of it. Laurent Jobs is the largest shareholder, but that's very different from ownership. What also is common to all this is a change in philosophy. 1970 was the year in which Milton Friedman published his famous article, probably the most read, certainly most quoted article ever published in the New York Times. The social responsibility of business is to maximize its profits. That's what he said, and it was influential in the decades that followed. But probably even more influential was a paper prepared the following year for the American Chamber of Commerce by Lawrence Powell, who became a Supreme Court justice. And what Powell was doing was he was looking at business reaction to these events of the 1960s. We've described 1968 with students rioting in the streets. Rudy Dutschke, who led some of these students talked about the long march through the institutions, propagating the idea that left-wing students could influence politics and business by joining established institutions and developing their ideas through them. There's some truth in that in terms of what has happened. But there is some truth also in the opposite. The long march through the institutions was something available to the right as well as to the left. And after the Powell Memorandum, we had the foundation which recommended that business should become more active in promoting the right kind of ideas in the academic world. We get the foundation of the Heritage Foundation. We get the Business Round Table established. And probably most importantly of all, the Olin Foundation sets up institutions to propagate law and economics activities. And over the next couple of decades, a great deal of academic work is done promoting the idea of the corporation as a nexus of contracts. So that the model of the corporation, which is in our minds, has changed. And of course, the background to all of this is changed by the political movements which followed from this. Again, reactions to the 1960s, and they are lead in the 1970s, in the late 70s, to the election of Reagan and Thatcher as leaders of major Western countries. So that's the long march through the institutions. And at the same time, we get this growth of the shareholder value movement. Jack Welch, who was proclaimed in 1999 the manager of the century by Fortune magazine, is associated with the promotion of shareholder value as a key item, key duty, obligation of corporate managers. And of course, General Electric, which was his company, added a good deal of shareholder value. Before he retired in 2001 rather. After he retired in 2001, things started fairly rapidly to unwind. General Electric finally disposed of its financial services businesses, which had been used to promote the rapid earnings growth and steady earnings growth, which had been, or steady alleged earnings growth rather, which had been a feature of General Electric through these years. There are a string of examples of this story, and General Electric is very far from the most extreme. Boeing was a major company still is a major company for the United States. At the end of the Second World War, Boeing had established itself as an aircraft producer, and it moved into civil aircraft production under the leadership of Bill Allen, who was a lawyer, but he'd become CEO, and he said of his company, we should eat, breathe, and sleep the world of aeronautics. That was the company that in the 60s launched the 737, which became the dominant short-haul jet around the world and basically brought low-cost air travel to a wide public, and the 747, which made intercontinental air travel feasible again for a large audience. That was the company that became the world's leading civil aircraft manufacturer by the end of the century. At the end of the century, it had overtaken McDonnell Douglas, the second largest American firm. And in the last decade of the century, Boeing and McDonnell Douglas merged. Legally, this was a takeover by Boeing. Culturally, it was a takeover by McDonnell Douglas. And McDonnell Douglas had absorbed the shareholder value mantra and the shareholder value doctrine. Phil Condit, who was CEO immediately, at that time CEO of Boeing, presided over the relocation of Boeing's headquarters. Condit explained what they'd done when they put the location of the headquarters up for auction among different municipalities. Chicago won. And Condit explained when the headquarters is located in proximity to a principal business, as ours was in Seattle, the corporation centre is inevitably drawn into day-to-day business operations, evidently a danger which you had to avoid, and Condit avoided it when he took the board in a plane to Chicago to open the new headquarters. Soon after that, Condit was forced out, not because of business but personal reasons, and succeeded by a McDonnell Douglas man, Harry Stonecipher. And Stonecipher explained when he became CEO, when people say that I changed the culture of Boeing, that was the intent. So it's run like a business rather than a great engineering firm. It is a great engineering firm, but people invest in a company because they want to make money. Boeing went further when Stonecipher was also forced out, again for personal indiscretions rather than for business reasons, and succeeded by an acolyte of Jack Welch's, Jay McNerney, who had been brought up in the culture of shareholder value. And that was the company that decided in 2010 not to redesign, not to build a new small plane to compete with a Boeing A320, with an Airbus 320, but instead to reconfigure the 737, which had first taken the air in the 1960s, to reconfigure the 737 to accommodate new, more fuel-efficient airlines. That was the 737 MAX, and of course you will know that the 737 MAX crashed disastrously in 2018 and 2019, took Boeing's stock price and reputation pretty much down with it. That's the story of Boeing. It's a story of a great company which was ultimately severely damaged by the pursuit of shareholder value. If I go back to Britain, I'd come to Britain's leading 20th century corporation. That, of course, was ICI. ICI had its origins in explosives and dyestuffs. But ICI adopted a long-term mission statement. ICI aims to be the world's leading chemical company, serving customers internationally through the innovative and responsible application of chemistry and related sciences. Through achievement of our aim, we will enhance the wealth and well-being of our shareholders, our employees, our customers and the communities which we serve and in which we operate. That was the company that began in dyestuffs and explosives. It switched its focus in the 1930s to petrochemicals and fertilizers, and then after the Second World War to pharmaceuticals and fabrics. ICI lost money for 20 years in pharmaceuticals until in the 1960s, a young chemist, Scottish chemist called James Black, led a team that discovered what were the first effective drug against hypertension, beta blockers. And from then on, pharmaceuticals developed into the profit engine of the company. But ICI changed. ICI divested the pharmaceutical division, but more importantly, it changed its mission statement. From the early 90s, ICI was not there for the responsible application of chemistry and related sciences. The purpose of ICI was to maximize value for our shareholders, not by searching out new businesses as they had done in the previous 50 years, but by focusing on businesses where we have market leadership, a technological edge, and a world competitive cost base. I first gave a talk interesting to make that comparison in 1996. It wasn't particularly well received at that time because ICI share price was doing rather well. It was doing rather well, but not for very long. This is what happened subsequently, and you will see that ICI finally died in 2007 when the rump of what was left of the company was taken over by AkzoNobel. I went to talk to the man who discovered beta blockers, James Black, or whose team discovered, because it was interesting that Black had left ICI soon after the discovery of beta blockers, and he went to join SmithKline, where he refocused their research, and they produced a drug which, imitated by Glaxo, became another best-selling drug, one that cured, or rather alleviated, another chronic disease of rich people, which is stomach ulcers. And that turned SmithKline into an internationally known pharmaceutical company. As I say, I went to ask Black why he had left ICI, and he said, the answer is very simple. ICI management wanted me to go on road shows promoting beta blockers, but what I wanted to do was discover new drugs, as of course he did for SmithKline. He said then, I think of it, I used to tell my colleagues that if they wanted to make money, there were easier ways to do it than pharmaceutical research. And then he shook his head and said, how wrong could I have been? I think of it as the principle of obliquity, that complex goals are most often achieved if pursued indirectly. That led me to the title of a book which I wrote in 2010 called Obliquity, that made essentially that point. Complex goals, including the creation of shareholder value, are often best pursued indirectly. The purpose of business, for me, is to build great businesses. That's what Alan did at Boeing. That's what Sloan did at General Motors. That's what ICI did in the first 2-3 decades of existence. It's what other people like Simon Marks did in building Marks and Spencer in the UK. It's even actually what Elon Musk did. Musk is, of course, regularly referred to correctly in a sense as the world's richest man. But Musk did not set out to become the world's richest man. What Musk actually set out to do was to build exciting new businesses in electric cars and in space. And by doing so, he made himself the richest man in the world. Creating shareholder value is best done by building great businesses. Ed Smith, the former England cricketer, actually reviewed my book, The Corporation in the 21st Century. He then referred me to books written by football and other sports coaches of various kinds, most of all to America's greatest football coach of the last part of the 20th century, a man called Bill Walsh. The title of his book is The Score Takes Care of Itself. If you build a great team, it will win matches. If you build a great business, it will create shareholder value. Thank you very much.
That was fabulous. I just say that because John is always a pleasure to have here at Panmure House, but to touch on Adam Smith, but to not make the lecture about Adam Smith, I think is fantastic. But to bring us through historically from Smith all the way through the 20th century to where we are today. And we ask, are we perhaps moving beyond the shareholder value paradigm to actually building big companies? Because you finished on Elon Musk, who has a reputation at the moment, but still has built two amazing companies that may still go on to revolutionize business and technology in the next few decades. So I'd like to
And if you could quit politics and get back to
yes,
business.
this is the problem. I said to John before we started, I say, so what's your view on specifically on Musk and Trump? And we may go into that, but hopefully not. But I do want to ask a question related to, because you brought it up, about the nationalization of the steelworks in Scunthorpe, which I think is fascinating from where we've come from, let's say, the so-called neoliberal revolution of privatizing everything to what we're seeing now as a renationalization of industry, not simply here in Britain, but across the world. Now, you refer to Smith, his promotion of free trade, Ricardo, that it's better to import steel from someone that can do it better and cheaper than you. However, much of the arguments around renationalization of major industries like steelmaking is because it's necessary for national defense and national security. In Smith's work, he recognizes national security as a significant component to creating the conditions for a vibrant commercial society. In that respect, then, how do you square that tension between the need for free trade, but on the other hand, the need for national security in the broadest sense, not simply from those attacking us, but the economic security? Because I think that's a key question that governments and we are dealing with today.
Can I refer you to another book of mine?
Of course.
This is part of the purpose of an evening like this, of course, which is Radical Uncertainty. Because the conclusion of that is that the way you deal with radical uncertainty is not that you can anticipate what is going to happen. It's rather that you build provisions that are robust and resilient to things you are not going to be able to predict. Now that's very relevant, I think, to supply chains. We, I hope, learned during the pandemic that we had not done enough to make our supply chains robust and resilient, and we need to do that. It seems to me very serious that we are as dependent as we are for chips on TSMC, the Taiwanese company that dominates the chips market. That is very different from saying that we ought to have a chip manufacturing plant in Scotland and another one presumably other ones in Northern Ireland, Southern Ireland and England in case the UK breaks up, and so on and so on. I think we need to be robust and resilient. If there was going to be no steel in the UK for a period of years, probably in fact invent something else. But the idea that nobody is going to sell us steel is preposterous.
So I could ask John many more questions, but I don't want to take the floor too much. So we have a microphone that will be going around. So if you have questions, I want to see hands going up. Arnab in the back, please.
Thank you very much, John. Fascinating book, lecture, and particularly, the dramatic transformation of manufacturing processes, which you very nicely described there. You also mentioned the airline thing, but that is the way you express that is in the services sector, but the same is going on in manufacturing. So, much of the assets are no longer owned by companies at all. They are leased. Even manufacturing assets are leased. And increasingly, much of the labor is also subcontracted from elsewhere. So the companies don't hold them at all on their books. Now, this, of course, dramatically has changed the way that businesses are run and the way that we would like to teach businesses to students. But my question is slightly different. As an economist working in the heart of Whitehall and so on and so forth, how do we understand production functions in this kind of way? So where assets are no longer owned by firms, where labor is no longer owned by firms, the neoclassical paradigm is out of the window. How do we do this? Do we go back to Calder? How exactly do we write production functions even, or think about them?
The idea that businesses are owned by people who built plants in the way that Henry Ford did at River Rouge is, as you say, completely out of date. Indeed, the whole structure that people describe as capitalism is out of date. There was a kind of tripart linkage from wealth to control of business, from wealth through to provision of capital, provision of plant to control of business. That tripart link no longer exists. That was true it was true classically at Senhouse Muir. It was true at Ford's River Rouge. It's not true of modern business. Modern business is a collection of capabilities, and capital has no central role in that. Capital, as I described, is like electricity and water. It is simply something you buy in. Labour, as you described, is also something you buy in. Now, we need to be careful about that. The labour you buy in is typically undifferentiated labour. It is the security people. It is not the senior management. And the senior management controls the organisation. We have to understand that modern businesses are controlled by professional managers. And what we need to do is build a cadre of professional managers who have the right kind of values, the right kind of understanding of business, and the right kind of imagination to develop new businesses in a changing environment.
Claire.
This time last year, we were here listening to, I think, one of your students, Colin Mayer, talking a bit about purpose in business. And I just wondered if we could link the two things together. Do you see in the kind of new world of corporations room for the evolution of more purposeful businesses, or businesses that think about the combination of capital and labour differently? And where do they fit in a world where perhaps purpose is not something that is getting as much attention as it might have been a while ago?
I think the trouble is the phrase purpose has given rise to a great deal of what one might politely call waffle. It is not the job of businesses to make the world a better place. It is the job of businesses to do business well. And I would much rather talk about the capabilities of a business than the purpose of a business. Capabilities are where it begins. The question is, what are the distinctive capabilities of a particular organization, and what are the best ways of using them in business? That was the story as told of ICI. ICI's capabilities were in chemistry, And it was very successful for 50 years in recruiting able chemists into business in ways that other British companies were not doing. As I described in beta blockers, getting great products which made a great deal of money as a result of that. That's how I see business. I think some of the discussion of business purpose is useful, but much of it is really another PR exercise. I've told the story of ICI many times. One time I told it was in 2006, just before the final disappearance of ICI. And a few days later, I got a pained letter from ICI's Vice President for Corporate Social Responsibility. And the Vice President for Corporate Social Responsibility explained at some length, and with the aid of a glossy brochure, that ICI might have screwed up the business, but had done a great job on corporate social responsibility. I thought that guy has no idea what corporate social responsibility really means.
But if I can ask a question, how different is that from the argument that Milton Friedman made in his 1970 piece? Because he was basically saying businesses should be in the business of making whatever their business is for. And they shouldn't be doing all these other things for society that should be for civil society, that should be the role of government, that businesses and the managers of businesses should be there to build businesses. Now that's been extended to the shareholder value argument, but has it not been, let's say, bastardized at the expense of Milton Friedman's real argument, which is similar to what you've just said?
When you frame it the way you have done it, I'd be on Friedman's side. But that is how Friedman did describe it in these terms. He also described it in other terms, actually in the same article. If I had it with me, I would quote it for you. It is that, he said the managers of a company are employees of the shareholders, and their job is to implement the wishes of shareholders, which will generally be to make as much money as possible for them. There are a lot of things wrong with that statement. Firstly, the managers are not employees of the shareholders. The shareholders may want to make as much money as possible, but as I've described, the way they will make money is if the managers build great businesses.
So we have time for two more questions. First Beth and then there. So,
hi, thank you for the fascinating talk. The principle of obliquity, am I saying that right?
Obliquity.
Obliquity. Does this apply?
I didn't invent it.
Okay, noted.
Black did.
Does it apply just in this business corporate context, or have you thought much about whether it applies more generally to like the aims of the state, for example, or other kinds of organisation?
I talk about it much more generally, and I can. If you read my book, you will get many other examples. I'd single out one because it's particularly striking at the moment, which is I talk at the beginning of the book about Notre Dame, which was built over 200 years by people where there was no grand design. No one really knew what the final result was going to be, but it was built by brilliant people, or some brilliant people, over 2 centuries. I used that to contrast it with people talking about business process re-engineering, who say you don't build businesses like this. You decide what your ambition is. You rethink the process from scratch, from the ground up, he said, and that's how you succeed in business. Notre Dame, of course, is interesting because we know that Notre Dame burnt down, and we know how it was rebuilt, it was rebuilt as close to what had existed before the fire as was possible. The French government did not ask if we were designing a great church for the center of Paris in the 21st century, what would it be like? They asked, can you build it something that looks like the church people have admired for many centuries? And most people think that was a good decision.
You had a question.
Thank you for that amazing lecture. My question would be that business runs on humans, and humans run on emotions. So you mentioned that Adam Smith's core values were empathy and sympathy, and you also mentioned that modern businesses need professionalism in managers. How do you bridge that gap with the psychology aspect of businesses? Because when I am a business psychology major, and what we learned from that is, even though you have IT and like business administration behind any market or any business, but psychology is the key aspect to any business. If you start it, if you like continue it, and even for the crashes, you need psychology. What do you think? How do we like bridge the gap between professionalism and a good marketing strategy in the coming years or in this 21st century?
Well, you don't build great businesses by giving people bonuses for creating shareholder value. I'm sure almost nobody has gone home thinking, I created a lot of shareholder value today, I bet they're pleased. People at Boeing did go home thinking we're building the best aeroplanes in the world. People at some of the other companies I've talked about did the same. That's the nature of the successful business, that people are excited about working for a great business. And the great business, as I've said several times, will create shareholder value, but that's incidental to the business of doing good business. And if that's what you think Milton Friedman said, and you can interpret what Milton Friedman said in that way, then I would go along with Milton Friedman.
I think we have time for one more question, or we can finish on what he thinks of Donald Trump. No other question? I guess, well, there we go. What's your view on current U.S. economic policy? 30 seconds.
Perhaps I'll let the minutes, the 30 seconds run out.
Run the clock down.
I think it's depressing that, firstly, so little economics is in economic policy in the US and elsewhere, indeed, and that the advice which is taken is mostly so poor.
Mm-hmm. On that note, a positive one. Please, let's thank Sir John Kay for what was a wonderful lecture. And I should say his book is for sale downstairs, and he will sign it for you, but you must buy the book for him to. And then he may answer a question or two. If this is your first time to Panmure House, I hope you enjoyed your time, and I hope you do come back again. We will likely have another Adam Smith lecture in the autumn. Next spring, we'll have Baroness Dambisa Moyo give an Adam Smith lecture in March, which should be fantastic. So we're building Panmure House, bringing it back to life as the home of social and economic debate here in Edinburgh, but also for the world. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful evening.